I am tired of people complaining that modern Pokemon games are too easy. If I had a nickel for each time I've seen a complaint about difficulty after a new Pokemon game releases, I'd have, well, a lot of nickels. I too used to be in this camp, wishing that Game Freak would make their games harder. I don't know if it's Stockholm Syndrome or I'm just entering the bargaining stage of the Kubler-Ross model, but I increasingly feel like Pokemon games don't need to be difficult in order to be fun. Furthermore, I'd argue that the core mechanics of the series are set up in such a way that Pokemon games will never truly be difficult, at least not in the way that long-time adult fans of the series want it to be. The complaints about difficulty really came into force after the release of X and Y, particularly in response to changes regarding the function of the EXP share. Unlike previous games, where the EXP share was a held item that you gave to one particular Pokemon, X and Y changed it to be a key item that you toggled on and off, and when it was on, it would give experience to all of the Pokemon in your party. In Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, Game Freak took it one step further, completely removing your ability to turn off the EXP share. This feature was carried forward into Sword and Shield. This permanently on EXP share created a horribly broken level curve in Sword and Shield that resulted in the player being hilariously over-leveled for almost all parts of the game, even if you actively tried to avoid all optional trainer battles. Game Freak has also implemented a wide variety of other minor changes over the years that have contributed to the sense that the games are being dumbed down. Your rival now chooses the type that's weak to yours, rather than the one that's strong against it. You're typically healed before major boss fights now too. Quality of life changes, like infinite TMs or Game Freak improving the learn sets of Pokemon over the years, have given the player access to stronger moves earlier than in the past. One of the worst offenders here is undoubtedly the affection mechanic, a ridiculous abomination that gives your Pokemon the equivalent of a focus band, bright powder, scope lens, and the ability Shed Skin, all for free and cannot be toggled off. But even if Game Freak reversed a lot of these smaller decisions from over the years, tuned the level curve a bit, and dialed back the hand-holding, it still wouldn't really make the games difficult. The underlying core design philosophy of Pokemon heavily limits the developer's ability to meaningfully modulate difficulty. In order to do so would require major changes to the underlying design philosophy that I don't envision Game Freak ever doing. Ultimately, the bigger picture is that I don't think difficulty is really what's wrong with modern Pokemon. Pokemon games have never exactly been that difficult. The difficulty issue is instead reflective of larger issues of polish and game quality, rather than being about the difficulty in and of itself. While players often focus on how badly planned the level curve has become in games like Sword and Shield, simply increasing the level of trainers isn't really going to solve the underlying problem. Let's be real, even though earlier entries in the series are definitely harder, they are not meaningfully difficult by any real stretch. Anyone with a basic understanding of type matchups and uses Pokemon with reasonably high base stat totals will easily breeze through any Pokemon game. Generation 2, which is often thought of having some of the most difficult fights in the series, namely with Whitney's Milk Tank and the final fight against Red at Mount Silver, are mostly a quirk of Generation 2's level curve suffering from the opposite problem of Sword and Shields. Rather than EXP being too plentiful, EXP is quite scarce in Generation 2 due to the lack of easily accessible rematches and the low levels of wild and trainer Pokemon. Whitney's Milk Tank is hard primarily because of how few options you have available at that point in the game when it comes to Pokemon and moves. Red is hard because his Pokemon are at a level that far exceeds what your team could reasonably reach after completing the game. Well, yes, I do remember how satisfying it was as a kid to beat Red with a team that was much lower leveled. I don't think that modulating levels is a particularly interesting approach to difficulty. When confronted with a challenging battle, your first instinct is to grind out a couple of levels because this is the easiest and most obvious way to increase your power level. You could, for instance, seek out a Pokemon in a nearby area that has an advantageous matchup against the gym you're struggling against, but why bother with that when you could just get a few more levels on your core team? This is especially true in the early game, because there are simply so few tools available to you in terms of moves, items, and Pokemon that grinding out more levels is often your only solution to overcoming difficult fights. For example, aside from the Machop available via trade at the Goldenrod department store, there are basically zero fighting type moves or fighting type Pokemon available for you to use on Whitney's Milk Tank. But simply going out and grinding enough levels until you have enough stats to brute force your way through is not an especially elegant or interesting approach. Even in self-imposed challenge runs like Nuzlocke, the dominant strategy usually ends up being just grinding out more levels to ensure that your Pokemon don't die. This tendency is why the hardcore Nuzlocke variant exists, which stipulates that players shouldn't use items in battle or overlevel their teams. To be clear, I think that a lot of the complaints about difficulty in recent games are justified. There's no reason that late game gym trainers or Elite Four members shouldn't have 4 teams of 6, or should have Pokemon that don't even have 4 complete moves. If Game Freak is going to have a permanently on EXP share, they need to balance the level curve around it better. But I ultimately think that these things, while easy fixes, don't get to the core of the problem, namely the underlying mechanics of Pokemon that make it extremely difficult to create battles that will meaningfully challenge a series veteran. I've heard a lot of people say that Game Freak should just implement a difficulty system, where you can choose a hard mode that gives the opponent traders more levels, better moves, and more intelligent AI, but at the end of the day, I still don't think this will overcome the core mechanical issues of Pokemon's design. The first of these big issues is symmetry. In Pokemon, each gym trainer or Elite Four member is restricted to using the same Pokemon, moves, and held items that you as the player could feasibly access. Compare this to most other JRPGs where the bosses have substantially more HP and usually get access to much stronger attacks or abilities beyond the ones that your party members could use. Because the AI is always going to be intrinsically disadvantaged compared to the decision making and planning of a real human being, this symmetry, in practice, heavily tilts the scales in favor of the player. This limitation is perhaps why Game Freak decided to shake up the traditional 8 Gym Leader and Elite Four format for Sun and Moon. By replacing some of the trainer battles for totem Pokemon, Game Freak was able to introduce some asymmetry that allowed for more interesting difficulty modulation. I remember that people were still complaining about the difficulty in Sun and Moon, most likely because of how hand-holdy the game is in its opening hours, but the totem fights were some of the most difficult experiences I've had in a casual playthrough of Pokemon. A good example of this is the Totem Lurantis fight from Sun and Moon. Unlike the previous totem Pokemon that start the fight by increasing their defensive stats, Lurantis starts the fight by increasing its speed by 2 stages, enabling it to outspeed pretty much any Pokemon you could muster against it. It also starts holding a Power Herb, allowing it to immediately fire off a powerful Solar Beam at one of your Pokemon. After its initial turn, it can summon a Cast form that can set up Sunny Day, protecting Lurantis from status conditions and enabling it to fire off even more devastating Solar Beams. In Ultra Sun and Moon, at the end of the main story, you face off against a massively buffed Ultra Necrozoma. It starts the fight by raising all of its stats by 1 stage, enabling it to one-shot almost any Pokemon you might have. These totem fights are interesting because by introducing asymmetry, they encourage the player to think outside of the box. While setting up Sun strengthens Lurantis' Solar Beam, it also increases the potency of super effective fire attacks. Before this fight, you're given access to Flame Charge, which can help to offset the speed boost that Lurantis gets. When I fought Ultra Necrozoma for the first time, I employed a Toxic stalling strategy. After setting up Toxic, I would strategically switch my Pokemon around to manipulate the AI and stall turns by switching into Pokemon that would resist the attacks that Necrozoma was likely to throw out. These fights are far from perfect, but I enjoyed that they forced me to think moderately outside of the box instead of just mindlessly clicking super effective attacks. Ironically enough, even though the implementation of Totem Pokemon allowed more interesting fights, this feature was probably not very well received, which is why Game Freak returned to the traditional 8 Gym Leader format for Sword and Shield. The other major problem is that the core battle mechanics are simply too exploitable to balance effectively. Meeting extremely basic conditions hands out massive damage multipliers, 200% for memorizing basic type matchups, and another 150% for simply using a move with the same type as your Pokemon, not to mention all the other multipliers for things like raising stats, held items, and abilities. In other JRPGs, having these kinds of multipliers is okay because of the asymmetry between the player and the bosses. But the symmetry of Pokemon makes it so that the extremely easy access to large damage multipliers enables an experienced player to more or less one-shot every Pokemon in the mid or late game. The problem also works in reverse. If the enemy trainer's Pokemon end up too overtuned, you end up in a situation where the player's Pokemon are just going to get one shot and steamrolled, which is similarly not fun for the player. To see how we might surmount these core mechanical challenges, we can look to the robust community of ROM hacks and Pokemon fan games that have cropped up over the years. The ingenuity and innovation of Pokemon fan games has always greatly impressed me, and made me even more cynical about how the Pokemon company doesn't seem to be able to replicate a modicum of the creativity of a ROM hack created by a single person. A good example of how not to approach difficulty can be seen in a game like Dark Hole Rising, where the difficulty primarily comes from arbitrarily high level spikes and deny the player adequate access to experience. This tends to be the approach that a lot of difficulty hacks take, ramping up the levels without much more thought put into it. This, for instance, is not a particularly interesting approach to difficulty. A much more interesting example can be seen in Pokémon Reborn, one of the first popular RPG Maker Pokemon fan games, and the one that arguably set the bar for difficult but fair. Right off the bat, Reborn implements a slate of changes that greatly ramps up the difficulty. Your levels are capped to prevent you from just over-leveling any challenge you might face, and the available Pokemon and money you're given early on are quite scarce, forcing you to be discerning about how you build your team and manage your resources. The fights throughout the game are difficult, but with proper planning and team building can be surmounted. Pokemon Rejuvenation, the spiritual successor to Reborn, has one of my favorite mechanics I've encountered in a Pokemon fan game, field effects. While Sun and Moon introduced field effects of things like misty and electric terrain, Rejuvenation takes it a step further. There's something like 40 different field effects, each with unique effects that can have major impacts on the battle. Most of the boss fights are designed in such a way that you fight them on a field that is advantageous to them, providing an interesting layer of asymmetry for the player to tackle and overcome. For example, when you face the Ghost-type gym leader, you fight her on a haunted field that buffs the power of Ghost types while weakening Dark, Fairy, and Psychic attacks. The field also buffs the accuracy of status moves like Hypnosis or Will-O-Wisp, which the gym leader uses to great effect against you. However, and this is the really interesting thing about field effects, using certain moves allows you to completely change the field. With the Haunted field, for example, if you use a move like Flash or Dazzling Gleam, you can change the field into a Blessed field. By changing into a Blessed field, you can turn what was once a disadvantage onto its head. Instead of buffing Ghost types, a Blessed field weakens the power of Ghost type moves, and even allows normal type attacks to hit Ghost types for super effective damage. While Reborn and Rejuvenation are quite challenging, the games also usually give you appropriate tools to overcome the difficult fights. Rather than just brainlessly leveling your Pokemon until you can brute force your way through, you're forced to carefully plan around your opponent's team, movesets, and field effects to build a strategy that allows you to succeed. The field effects in Rejuvenation, in particular, really reward careful strategizing by allowing the player to turn what's supposed to be a handicap into a source of power. However, the problem here is that these games can very easily verge into becoming less of a JRPG and more of a puzzle game. Rather than building a set of Pokemon that you train and evolve over the course of your journey, it's extremely unlikely that you could beat these games with a static team of 6 Pokemon, the way that most people casually play through Pokemon games. You're forced to train and catch a wide array of Pokemon, such that you're able to break out a large set of tools to confront various challenges throughout the game. In some cases, it can feel like you're basically playing a puzzle game, trying to work out the particular solution the developers intended for you to use to overcome a difficult fight. Other difficulty hacks like Emerald Kaizo or Radical Red also run into similar issues, where the difficulty forces you into using very particular sets of Pokemon or heavily min-maxing to have any chance of winning. This approach to difficulty is much more akin to something like the Shin Megami Tensei series. In SMT, the demons you recruit are explicitly temporary. Your demons gain experience slower than the player and generally don't learn many interesting new moves, heavily encouraging the player to continually fuse their demons together to create new, stronger demons. Most difficult fights usually have a couple of demons that can make the fight much easier. In Shin Megami Tensei 3, the Matador fight is infamous for being rather difficult for newcomers to the series. He uses incredibly strong moves and has no weaknesses. However, the player can fuse demons that resist force attacks, like Ame no Uzume, to counter Matador. The problem here is that this approach to difficulty is antithetical to one of the fundamental conceits of the Pokémon series. From its inception, one of the main recurring themes of the series has been that Pokémon are meant to be seen as partners and friends. In Gold and Silver, after you beat Karen, she makes this message extremely explicit, telling you, quote, "Strong Pokémon, weak Pokémon. That is only the selfish perception of people. Truly skilled trainers should try to win with their favorites," end quote. The entire conflict between Paul and Ash in the Diamond and Pearl anime is that Paul sees Pokemon as tools and only cares about raising strong Pokemon. Paul's entire character arc is him learning to move past this mindset and come to treat his Pokemon more as partners rather than as tools to win battles. If you're someone that exclusively plays the games with Pokemon that have a base stat total higher than 500, you're clearly going to have a much easier time than someone whose favorite Pokemon is Furret or something. While it's technically possible to beat these enhanced difficulty fan games with suboptimal Pokemon with low base stats, it's probably not going to be the most fun experience. At the point at which you have a game where you have to carefully build your team around certain types of Pokemon for each fight, you're basically playing Shin Megami Tensei and not Pokemon anymore. I think there's something to be said for this kind of accessibility that allows people to beat Pokemon games with whatever characters they please. I've been playing Pokemon since I was 5 years old. I have an intuitive understanding of all the type matchups, moves, and mechanics. I used to dabble in playing competitively on Pokemon Showdown. Compare this to someone like my girlfriend, who has never played a Pokemon game before and only started with Pokemon Violet. While I usually build my main story team around Pokemon that have good move pools and decent base stat totals, she just catches whatever Pokemon she thinks are cute. We're talking like she benched Fuecoco after it evolved because she didn't like how it looked anymore. The likelihood that this approach to team building could ever easily beat a game like Rejuvenation or Radical Red is laughable. Finally, I think a lot of the people complaining about difficulty in modern Pokemon games are at least slightly blinded by nostalgia. Pokemon games have never been particularly difficult. Generations 1 and 2 are infamous for being extremely broken mechanically. The so-called good AI from Red and Blue will have the enemy trainers always use a move with a type that's super effective against your Pokemon, even if it isn't a damaging move, resulting in situations where you have Lorelei's Dugong spamming Rest against fighting and poison types. In the climactic final battle, your rival's Executor has no stab moves and exclusively relies on Stomp and Barrage as its only damaging moves. Even in generations 3 through 5, the games most people talk about when they say that Pokemon games used to be harder, aren't really hard in any absolute sense. Harder than generation 6 and onward, yes. Hard in the sense of being able to meaningfully challenge a veteran player? Not really. The most hilarious example of this is Pokemon Black's Challenge Mode, which it unlocked after beating the main game. The Challenge Mode increases the levels of all of the trainers, with the trainers at the end of the game having 5 additional levels than where they're at in the base game. The thing is, for whatever reason, the opponent Pokemon in the Challenge Mode retain the same stats as their counterparts in the normal game. Because of how Generation 5's scaled experience system works, the Challenge Mode is actually easier, as your Pokemon now get more experience for fighting Pokemon with the same stats. No doubt, a major part of the difficulty nostalgia comes to the fact that the people who played these games were kids at the time, and that they're now playing Sword and Shield as adults. Of course, you remember those older games being harder because your team probably just consisted of your one over-leveled starter with 4 different attacking moves. I remember when I played Pokemon Fire Red for the first time, I exclusively used my Charizard and still managed to beat the game. When I played Diamond for the first time, I remember my team consisting of only Torterra and Staraptor. Cynthia is arguably the most difficult champion in the series, having a well-balanced team and an ace Pokemon that got relegated to Ubers. But the fight is still easily exploitable if you have any modicum of knowledge. Even at like 9 years old, I figured out that I could set up against her Spiritomb of X items and then just sweep the rest of her team. I bring this up because I don't really think that the lack of difficulty is primarily what's wrong with modern Pokemon. As evidence of this, let's look at Heart Gold and Soul Silver, which are widely considered two of the best games in the entire franchise. These games still keep the extremely broken level curve and gym teams from the original games. Jasmine, the 6th gym leader, uses a team consisting of 2 Magnemites and a Steelix. Price, the 7th gym leader, uses a team of 2 Seals and a Piloswine that are at the same level as Jasmine's Pokemon. I don't think a case can really be made that these games are any more difficult than the more recent entries in the series. But Heart Gold and Soul Silver are still remembered extremely fondly because, well, Game Freak actually tried. They expanded Kanto, making it feel less like an afterthought and more like a bona fide second region to explore. They added new features like follower Pokemon or the Pokeathlon, not to mention the Pokewalker, one of the weirdest but most interesting things Game Freak has ever done. This is all to say that I'm increasingly okay with modern Pokemon games being easy. Realistically, there's no way that Game Freak will ever modify the core mechanics to such a degree just to make a difficult game for 20-somethings like me who have been playing Pokemon for almost 2 decades. The problem is that Game Freak puts out buggy, unpolished, poorly optimized games with uninteresting characters, area designs, and mechanics just to meet a yearly release cycle. People have legitimate complaints about difficulty, but if Game Freak bothered to put in a modicum of effort pushing out polished, innovative, unique games, I don't think people would care nearly as much about the perceived difficulty anymore. As evidence, just look back at Heart Gold and Soul Silver. At the end of the day, modern Pokemon has its share of issues, but I think that difficulty has been greatly overstated as one of them.